tiger's eye, rubellite, lapis lazuli, jasper, opal, malachite, onyx, meteorite, and so on. All these stones are incredibly beautiful natural phenomena with different colors, gradients, and patterns. Currently, there's a very strong interest in old hard stone watches on the market, but a few years ago it looked very different. Art Deco and Art Nouveau were all the rage. But as tastes change in fashion, so it is in the watch world. Today, collectors appreciate the technology and decorative aspects of semi-precious stone dials, and they are just so different. In today's video, we explain you how and why stone dials found their way into watchmaking, exactly which stones were used, and the exciting and challenging process of how raw stone become a dial in the first place. First and foremost, let's take a moment to explore the history of stone dials and why they are such a great option. It may surprise you to hear that gemstone dials are actually a more modern development, at least as far as watchmaking is concerned. So we don't have to travel too far back in time today, because the beginning of stone dials was heralded in the 1960s. Each decade has seen a significant movement in art and culture. And the 1960s were no different. Everything was about freedom, free expression, free choice of clothing, sexuality, and opposition to war. This also led to people's clothing being colorful, because it was a flower power era. And people were tired of the changeable wars of previous generations. So it was a kind of revolution that ushered in an era of peace and art. And when such movements made waves around the world, it not only created new fashion trends of clothing, but also affected all other areas, including the world of watches. On this graph you can see the relative use of dial colors from 1940 to 2000 with the color blue, gold, black, silver and white. As we can see from this graph, the classic dial color of the 1950s was white with almost 70%, followed by black, gold and silver. So no colorful dials were in sight. But in the beginning of the 60s, the taste of watch lovers changed, and one could observe the first appearance of colored non-stone dials with blue color. And as already mentioned, the age of stone dials also began in the early 1960s. There were some experiments with mother of pearl dials for pocket watches and wristwatches. But for the use of stone dials, the cases would have had to be much thicker, as movements took up a lot of space. When we think of dials made of stones, we understandably think first and foremost of Rolex. But the pioneer in this field was actually Piaget, starting in the end of the 1950s with the introduction of the ultra-thin 9P movement, just 2 mm thick. It allowed Piaget to explore new decorative possibilities for its dials by allowing more free space in their cases. Hard stone dials were something new that no one had done before. The idea of putting a mineral or gemstone at the center of a dial was quite daring. After several years of growing sales success, Piaget launched the first series of watches with stone dials in 1963, with beautiful 1 mm cuts of lapis lazuli, opal, malachite, tiger's eye and many others. It was a delicate process that wasted a lot of material, but more on that later. A Piaget watch with a jade dial and a gold bracelet was even worn by Jackie Kennedy on her wrist. At that time, Valentin Piaget, the grandson of the company's founder, even sent his designers to couture shows for inspiration. Back in the day was a real connection between fashion and watchmaking. Piaget wanted to keep up with the fashion and creative circles of the time, which is clearly reflected in their creations. By the end of the 1960s, there were more than 30 different gemstones to choose from. But it was still a relatively small business, offering custom watches for Piaget customers. It was clear that this market needed to be tapped, and other brands such as Cartier, Vacheron Constantin and Rolex, to name just a few, began to recognize this opportunity. In each following decade, at least a handful of brands have kept the flame of decorative dials alive. The 1970s also marked the beginning of Rolex's meteoric rise as a flashy status symbol. Thanks to the Datejust and the Day-Date, Rolex had made eye-catching gold cases and diamond hour markers the norm for its men's and women's watches. So dials with stones were the next logical step. Judging by a table of dial codes from the 1970s, there were at least 126 different configurations that Rolex offered, with a variety of stones such as onyx, obsidian, jasper, and even fossils of tiny sea creatures. Finally, in the 1980s, the quartz crisis crippled much of the luxury watch industry. Some brands turned to the steel sports watch formula, others switched to affordable quartz watches, and still others died out altogether. The stone dial had gone out of fashion, but a few stragglers still survived. Companies like Cartier, for example, survived with their Master Cartier line. Like this piece here with a black onyx dial from the early 80s. It features a 925 silver case with gold plating and a black onyx dial. But as bigger, chunkier watches became the norm, the space for such elegant materials quickly disappeared from the catalogs. In the decades that followed, up to the present day, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Patek Philippe, Bulgari, Chopin and many others have been launched in a wide variety of price ranges. Even the Omega Seamaster 300 can now be purchased with a lapis lazuli or malachite dial, proving that it is possible to combine an elegant sporty style with precious metals in a way that is not over flashy or kitschy. Since 2017, more and more watchmakers are adopting this stone retro style in making fine watches while adding a touch modernity by even using meteorite stone. Apropos stone, there are hundreds of different types that have been used to make dials. Now let's move on to the most commonly used types. No two pieces are alike, as a stone is used in its natural form and becomes distinctive through the aging process. One of the most important properties of gemstone material is color. The color of a stone is a result of light rays being absorbed or reflected in the material. Color perception is also affected by the stone's texture, luster, transparency, size, inclusion, patterns, and light source or type. Let's start with the least rare, but probably the most beloved stone, onyx. Compared to other gemstones, onyx is relatively inexpensive as a rough stone, and stones with inclusions can be had for as little as $15 per kilo. Of course, these are only approximate values, because the stones used for dials had to be of the highest possible quality. Black onyx is characterized mainly by its simplicity and its striking contrast with gold. It is timeless, and watches with onyx dial are fashionable and to combine with everything. Places where it is found include Yemen, Brazil, Madagascar, Mexico, Pakistan, Greece, Uruguay, and the United States. The Persians and Indians swore that the worn stone protected them from evil eyes. It is also said that childbirth was more painless to bear. The Romans saw in the onyx stone simply the useful and used it for carving. The next stone, my favorite next to the opal, is a so-called tiger's eye. It is found mainly in South Africa and Western Australia, but also in China, India, Canada, and the United States. In terms of price, this mineral form is comparable to the onyx. Together with the onyx, lapis lazuli and malachite form the most commonly used stones for most vintage watches. The light is reflected silky at different angles. Needless to say, this looks simply stunning in a watch. As you can see, with these two stones in the rough, the uncut tiger's eye stone does not have much in similarity to its finished form. It is very rough and matte. It bears the name tiger's eye because when it cut, it shows a cat eye effect due to light shimmer and looks similar to a tiger's eye. Tiger eye is a gemstone from the quartz group. It has a beautiful golden brown striped appearance with a silky luster and represents courage and motivation. According to mythology, this stone will help you to be successful and confident in everything you do. And who would not like to have these qualities? As I mentioned before, I love this stone. It is a richly layered dial with orange and brown tones that jumps off the wrist at every glance. Another popular and less rare, compared to some of the stone types shown today, is made of lapis lazuli. The finest examples are extracted in Afghanistan from mines located at an altitude of 3,500 meters, which makes them extremely difficult to reach. The stones are mined with dynamite and can shatter when exploded, often making them unusual for dials. So high-quality lapis lazuli has become a rarity. Gradually, other locations of lapis lazuli were discovered in Pakistan, Burma, Siberia, Chile, the United States, and Canada. In terms of price, it is twice as valuable as tiger's eye or onyx at around $30. But as already mentioned, it can quickly cost up to $1,000 in the best quality. The word lapis is Latin and means stone. Lazuli stands for blue. The blue color is very intense and stands out on the wrist. Furthermore, compared to onyx dials, there are many more white and yellow inclusions here. The last stone we will take a closer look at today is the opal. whereby high-quality opals are sometimes more valuable than diamonds. In my opinion, they also look much more interesting. What this stone does with incoming light is simply breathtaking. The main deposit of the opal is in Australia. Other places of discovery are Mexico, Nevada in the United States, and Indonesia. When the sunlight hits it, the opal glows in extraordinary colors, which remind of the color play of the sea or a rainbow. This great gemstone offers a color spectrum from gray to blue, amber, green, red, orange to brown, black, or even colorless, transparent and white. The Bedouins believe that the opal contains lightning and falls from the sky during thunderstorms. Opal has a soft heart that ranges from 5 to 6 on the Vickers hardness scale, while diamonds reach a value of 10. For this reason, there is a high risk of cracking during mining, cutting, and polishing. Unfortunately, the opal often cannot withstand the internal stresses and strains that occur during the manufacturing process, and thus it cannot be used for larger dials. Nevertheless, Rolex has managed to use it in the 36 mm Datejust. Most watches with opals were well under 30 mm. Since opals contain up to 20% water, they also run the risk of cracking as they dry. For all these reasons, high-quality opal is rare and must be handled with great care, as an opal plate for a single dial can cost up to $7,000. So enough about individual stones. Finally, we would like to introduce you to the process how a rough stone became a dial. First of all, from a technical point of view, stone dials are a visual sign of a watchmaker's skill. Many naturally occurring stones are in fact notoriously breakable due to their physical properties. For watchmakers, this task was quite a challenge. Only a few craftsmen, who are also called lapidarists, had the necessary skills and experience to work on such dials, because a small mistake could quickly mean the end. Each stone reacts differently to the cutting process and looks different depending on its thickness. For this reason, the waste rate at the time was up to 80%. In the 1960s, when the process was still experimental, many dials broke during cutting or when the hands were set. Therefore, stone dial blanks were cut to an initial thickness of 1 mm as opposed to the 0.4 to 0.6 mm required for conventional dials. First of all, getting the right stone takes time, because you need to be absolutely sure of the quality and purity of the material as well as the reliability of the supplier. Then it takes a skilled craftsman to cut and polish the stone to perfection, without affecting the natural color gradient or texture, while keeping the color and layers intact. Although the tools for cutting stone are more advanced today, the techniques of stone cutting have not changed since primitive man created stone tools. Once the stones arrive, the polishing phase follows. The careful polishing is done by hand. After that, the stones are cut into slices, and these slices are almost the same size as the final piece. Normal grinders and diamond-tipped saws are used in this cutting process. It can take up to an hour to give a dial its final shape. After that, each dial undergoes another round of polishing. This time, holes are drilled to create small spaces for the applications, apertures, and hands. After that, the final phase of hand polishing must therefore be done with extremely care. During this process, the craftsman slowly sands each dial until it's reached a density of 0.8 mm. Even today, there are only a few watchmakers who are willing to devote themselves to the painstaking process of making dials from stone, because the production involves a lot of work and expense. So that's all for today. We hope that we could bring you a little bit closer to the topic of stone dials and that you could learn something new. So have a nice day, and we hope to see you again in our next video.